This morning's meeting. I will just say who's in the room with myself. I have Stephen Dunn, and I have the Vice Chair Kelly Armstrong and Mark Durkin. And then on Starleaf we have Andy Allen and Ashleen Riley. So you are all welcome to today's committee meeting. As you know, members, today's meeting is solely to take evidence on the private tenancies bill. No other matters will be discussed. So can I start off by asking, or just remind members of requirement to declare any interest they may have in relation to items under discussion today? Stephen?
I declare an interest of private landlord, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Likewise, Chair, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, then we're going to move on to agenda item 1, which is apologies. Anybody aware of any apologies? No, nothing? Okay. Moving on to agenda item 2, which is draft minutes. Members, you'll find the draft minutes of the meeting of the 9th of November 2021 at page 6. Are members content to agree? The minutes as drafted?
Agreed.
Yep.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll move on then to agenda item 3, which is private tenancies bill papers. Members have been provided at page 11 with a request to brief from Property Mark. Just to advise you that a briefing has now been arranged for our meeting on Thursday. Members, you've also been provided with a follow-up briefing paper from Raise at page 24. The paper has been prepared following the Raise presentation to the committee on the private tenancies bill on the 21st of October. Members requested information on a range of issues, including portable appliance testing in other jurisdictions, including landlord responsibilities, protections in other jurisdictions for tenancies of under 12 months, responsibility for fire, smoke and monoxide alarms in common areas, defining a landlord's knowledge of disrepair in relation to fire, smoke and carbon monoxide alarms, responsibility for repair and maintenance of heating appliances, whether there will be any changes to the landlord registration scheme, time limits for tenancy deposits, rationale for different commencement dates in the bill, and the tie-in between the bill and the current HMO legislation. Some of the points raised by the committee require clarification or information from the department. Raise has requested this, and it will be forwarded to the committee whenever that's been received. Members, any queries or comments with that are content to note at this stage? Content to note?
Content to note, yeah.
Thank you. All right, then we'll move swiftly on to agenda item 4, which is a briefing from Fuel Property Coalition NI on the private tenancies bill. Members, the briefing paper is at page 51 of your pack. And can I then welcome to our meeting Pat Austin and Jamie Miller? There we go. You are both very welcome to the meeting today. Good to see you again. Pat, is it yourself that's going to give us our briefing?
Actually, no, it's Jamie's going to.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead, Jamie.
Hiya. First of all, thanks, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the invitation to give evidence today. For members who don't know us, National Energy Action are a fuel property charity working to secure affordable warmth for disadvantaged energy consumers and vulnerable or low-income households. And we're also the chair of the Northern Ireland Fuel Property Coalition, a coalition with over 160 members looking to tackle this key issue. As our area of expertise lies within fuel poverty, our primary focus of our brief relates to Clause 9 on energy efficiency regulations, but we'll also briefly touch on Clause 10. I'd also just like to put on record that NEA are supportive of the comments raised by Housing Rights, who we work closely with, and we know they've previously briefed the committee. We know that the cold kills. Between 2017 and 2020, there was a cumulative 3,151 excess winter deaths in Northern Ireland. And according to the WHO, a third of these deaths can be directly attributed to people living in cold homes. Year on year, the most frequent cause of excess winter deaths is found to be respiratory disease, followed by circulatory health conditions. Both of these conditions are badly exacerbated by living in a cold home. Rising energy prices, welfare cuts, and stagnant wages are causing people to struggle more and more during the winter months. And as an organisation, National Energy Action are deeply concerned as we face the winter ahead on the back of further energy price hikes. We recognise that the private rented sector plays a key role in meeting housing need in Northern Ireland, but unfortunately, it's our experience that a significant portion of the private rented sector properties can be considered non-decent. By this we mean properties that have poor standards of insulation, energy efficiency, or they've got inadequate home heating systems. Households in the private rented sector have little or no agency of their payment type, their heating type, or which, if any at all, energy efficiency measures they have in place. And this means that tenants are often exposed to higher energy costs and the greater risks associated with living within fuel poverty. Within the private rented sector, 26% of households were found to be in fuel poverty in the last house condition survey in 2016. But we believe with the current price rises that this is probably an underestimate, and if anything, it's probably significantly higher now. There are a number of schemes in place in Northern Ireland to improve energy efficiency, but unfortunately there's been a low penetration of interventions within the private rented sector. This is due in parts to low engagement with landlords historically, but it's also due to the design of the policy within these schemes, which often provides a split incentive whereby landlords are required to match fund measures without any legislative requirements in place to drive landlords to pursue them. NEA strongly welcome the Private Tenancies Bill as the first in a series of legislative reforms to improve standards, energy efficiency and affordability for households. We especially welcome Clause 9 of the bill. However, we believe that it could perhaps go further by seeking to establish minimum energy efficiency standards within the private rented sector as a matter of priority. We believe that doing so has the potential to help lift households out of fuel poverty and therefore save lives. In our opinion, there's a pressing need to improve housing quality within the sector. Under the current fitness standard, the stipulation for adequate provision of heating can in practice be satisfied by the presence of an electric socket into which a tenant can plug an electric heater. And we've experienced these circumstances firsthand when supporting fuel poor families, so we can attest to the hardship that this can bring. We believe that minimum energy efficiency standards are the best and most effective way to ensure progress in this area, and we believe that an EPC rating of Band C for properties within the private rented sector should be the considered target. This would be aligned with the fuel poverty targets established in England and Wales, and it's likely soon to be the adopted standard for the private rented sector in England following a consultation process last year. We know that energy efficiency improvements offer the tried and tested cost-effective approach to reducing household energy consumption, and furthermore, we know that improvements in domestic energy efficiency will be essential if Northern Ireland is to effectively decarbonise its domestic sector in efforts to reach net zero emissions targets. Analysis by the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's Home Energy Consultation Authority found that the main cost required to raise energy efficiency of dwellings in Northern Ireland to at least Band C would be around £6,200 per dwelling. Whilst we recognise that this isn't an insignificant figure, we also believe it shouldn't be considered prohibitive either. There would be scope as well to legislate for exemptions or a cost cap on the amount required for home improvements. We would also like to briefly mention a few comments with regards to Clause 10 on electrical safety standard regulations. Campaigners for electrical safety tell us that just like gas safety regulations, electrical installations and appliances should be checked by a competent person every 5 years, and we believe this seems prudent and should not be considered a prohibitive cost on landlords. During 2019, 58% of all accidental fires in homes were caused by an electrical source by products including dishwashers, cookers and fridge freezers, and these appliances are in the main provided by landlords in the private rented sector. Finally, I would just like to conclude by mentioning the issue of damp and mould growth within the private rented sector, which we believe also deserves some consideration. Damp and mould growth affects many households in Northern Ireland, but unfortunately it's very difficult to obtain recent data on the estimated number of homes that are affected, given that condensation alone doesn't constitute as a form of unfitness. Many factors contribute to condensation, including inefficient heating and insulation, or issues around the fabric of the dwelling itself. Under the current fitness legislation, the environmental health departments are unable to serve any notice upon a landlord if damp is determined to be caused of condensation. As a result, many cases of condensation are deemed to be behavioural, and there's no possibility for further recourse for the tenant. In the worst cases, the walls are badly affected by mould growth, causing householders to continuously breathe harmful spores, which can further aggravate a number of respiratory conditions. That's all our comments. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present them to you, and we welcome any questions from members. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks very much. And I suppose I just firstly want to just make comment about what you'd stated on the excess winter deaths because of poor heating in homes, and I think that's very much worth putting on the record. I know them whenever we had our party meeting with you last week, Paul Frew certainly was brought that up in our meeting with yourself. And it is pretty sad in this day and age when we are seeing people dying because they can't heat their homes or because their homes are poorly insulated, and it's the cost of heating those homes. I just on your final point there that you'd said, I'll come to it first around damp and mould. I mean, as MLAs, we know that our vast majority of our housing executive stock is covered in damp and mould. Which we're constantly told is condensation. So there is a big big job of work, not only within the private rented sector, but also within the social sector that needs to be done there. Just I mean, I don't know how we work that into the bill, but if we can work in the whole damp and mould issue into this bill, that would be great. But also around the minimum standards. This vexes me greatly because I hear this all the time, whether it's new builds, whether it's retrofits, about minimum standard. I mean, I believe that surely we should be doing the very, very best, and minimum standard is not good enough. So just maybe if you would just go into a little bit more detail about how we can address that. And then also you talked about that the bill could go further to bring forward targets for minimum energy efficient standards within the private rented sector. If you just could go on to a little bit more detail on that as well, Jamie.
Yeah, certainly. If you don't mind, I'll just start with the last point there on minimum energy efficiency standards. So, as I mentioned, the standards in England or Wales were consulted upon last year, and within that, the policy outlined is to implement Band C within the private rented sector. And as part of that, there would be a number of schemes rolled out to support landlords in achieving Band C, and there's also a legislative process around exemptions. So there's things like if the cost is prohibitive, there's a £3,500 cap proposed, so it might be upgraded to a £5,000 cap. So essentially, if it costs a landlord more than that amount of money, they'd be exempt from having to meet these standards. And it's reviewed every 3 years to try and encourage continual improvement within the sector.
Jamie,
Perhaps
before you go
Yeah,
on,
sorry.
can I just ask you, what does Band C actually look like? What does Band C mean?
Well, less than 50% of Northern Ireland households are Band C. So it's quite complex. With everything, as more technology comes out, the bands do tend to shift, similar to the way bands on electrical appliances have shifted over time. But Band C properties probably have a reasonable standard of loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, and a functioning and reasonable boiler and energy home heating system. Pat, do you want to come in on the damp and mould aspect?
Yes, I think that historically, Paul, you're absolutely right. It was very easy just to say it's a behavioural issue in relation to the mould and condensation in homes. But as the technology and stuff has developed, we've realised that it isn't that. There's, in some properties, a high level of poor quality cavity wall insulation, and that's almost, well, it's not almost, it is worse than having no cavity wall insulation, because it can breach and can just sort of develop problems in damp and mould. So there needs to be a strategy for Northern Ireland, an energy efficiency strategy. And despite, a lot of these issues happening within the Northern Ireland Housing Executive as well, the Housing Executive have also done some good work in scoping out some of these issues too, but there needs to be progress in really getting action. So there's no point in doing reports upon reports unless we can get some money in and get remedial action done where houses, certainly because it's a public health issue, if the cavity wall insulation is failing, causing damp and mould, and there needs to be action in and around that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just the problem is we're awfully good here in the Northern Ireland Assembly of doing reports. We have reports on everything, and sometimes we have 4 or 5 reports on the same thing. Yeah, but action actually needs to be taken. So no, that's grand.
Absolutely. The HECA authority, which is owned by the Housing Executive, has done some good work in it's starting that process of saying how much is this going to cost. But the industry needs to gear up as well. And industry, I know, have been lobbying quite some time for the extraction of cavity wall insulation, and also that in Northern Ireland, where we have a high prevalence of wet weather as well, it's not the case now that every cavity wall should be filled. So industry needs to be improved. There needs to be that one-stop shop that householders who even want to do this in their own back, which a lot of people have said, I would want to get that tested. That we don't have the infrastructure there yet to do that, and that needs to be progressed, which we believe will happen through the energy strategy as well. But we need to get, just again, keep saying this, it's warm words, we need to get action.
Okay. Thank you for that, Pat. I'm going to open up to members. Kelly, you'd indicate you want to come in?
Thank you very much, Jamie and Pat. Good to speak to you again, Jamie. Jamie, I wanted to go back to you when you talked in Clause 9 about the energy efficiency. You happened to mention about split payments where landlords would have match funding. Have you any evidence of how that has worked elsewhere across the islands?
Yes, so in Northern Ireland, particularly within programmes like Northern Ireland Sustainable Energy Programme, landlords need to meet 50% of costs, and we know that uptake has been low. Match funding still exists in the schemes in England, so there's the two new schemes that are about to be rolled out, the Green Homes Grant and the Home Upgrade Grant, are becoming next year, but in the existing version of the Home Upgrade Grant, landlords are liable to a third of the costs under measures. The difference is that with the fuel poverty target in England, there is a legislative emphasis. There's a carrot and a stick to encourage landlords to actually uptake these measures. In Northern Ireland, we don't have anything to push or nudge landlords into looking into these schemes. So there has been better progress made across the water.
I'm just thinking about the minimum energy efficiency standards where you've talked about the potential cost of £6,200 per property. If we expect the landlords to pay even 50% of that, do you think that could take landlords out of the market?
Possibly. It's not my area of expertise, so I wouldn't want to comment upon it too much. What I would say, though, is that there is the possibility for innovative approaches towards this. So we've seen concepts like green mortgages being considered as well in England and Wales, and there's no reason there might be options for green loans or green grants as well to help landlords do that. The way we sort of understand it is if the energy efficiency of the home is being improved, the standard and quality of the property is being improved, so hopefully the value of the property as well would be going up with that.
In Clause 10, you talked about the need for a competent person to do the checks every 5 years. I think I'm coming along that. We've heard it for so many. What is your understanding then of a competent person, or do you have a qualification in mind for that person?
I'm afraid I don't. I'm not an electrician, I'm afraid. What we would say is similar to how it's handled with gas, and that there would be some form of register of safe engineers that are qualified is what we would like to see. And we know there's been a similar system established in Scotland, and we've been told that it's effective and it's doing its job well.
Earlier, the chair had asked you about what was Band C. I was glad she asked that because I was going to ask that. But I'm just thinking with regards to Band C and energy efficiency levels. Pat, you had mentioned the energy strategy. With respect to the energy strategy, are you seeing a very clear outcome coming from them that the energy efficiency level should be Band C as well?
Yes, well, there was clear signalling that there's going to be an energy efficiency programme for Northern Ireland. So I would be hopeful that would be in place. And then I think there would potentially be further consultations on, what those actions are or what we scope out, what we can do. But definitely energy efficiency is what we're calling the first fuel. The cheapest unit of energy is the one you don't have to use, not the one you can't afford to use. But so it really needs to be up there front and central to any energy strategy for Northern Ireland PLC, but in particular the worst get first, so fuel poor households get first would be our campaign call.
Okay. And the chair had mentioned damp. Damp is something that plagues quite a lot of our existing houses across Northern Ireland. The energy strategy, just to keep us abreast, are you aware if the energy strategy have a direct target towards the dealing with damp in homes across or in premises across Northern Ireland?
I don't is the answer to that. I just hope we start to see what that strategy looks like, to start getting action plans out now, especially in the light of the fact that it's holding up the fuel poverty strategy, and perhaps the whole rollout of an energy efficiency programme for Northern Ireland would help us address any of those issues. We have, call it the hive system, so it's heat, insulation, ventilation or extraction, and it's probably one of those 4 issues that are causing dampness, and that's where we try to sort of unpick that. And if we get a better industry, we get better awareness within our own organisations and within the one-stop shop, we should be able to identify those issues much better than we're currently doing.
And just finally, just to ask you to clarify, if we have energy efficiency regulations that take us up to Band C, and we have electrical safety standards, do you believe that will deal with the damp issue, or will we be throwing, or landlords be throwing good money after bad, and we will still have that issue? I suppose this is down to the level. Is Band C enough?
Sorry, I'll pick this one. Sorry, Kelly, it's a hard one to answer because with all things energy efficiency, it's quite specific to each individual property and home. What Pat was alluding to before there about how we know damage is usually caused by the hive model, so heat, insulation, ventilation and extraction, 2 of those things can be directly attributed to the energy efficiency and the warmth of a home. So we do believe improving the EPC band to Band C should help a significant number of properties with regards to damp, but it would be inaccurate to say it will help every property because it is quite situational.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really helpful. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Pat.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. You say 58% of all accidental fires in home were caused by an electrical source by such products, including dishwashers, cookers and fridge freezers. This is something that I've been highlighting every week while we take evidence on this. First of all, do you know what the remaining percentage causation is?
No, sorry.
With the 58% you cite with regards to accidental fires, dishwashers, cookers and fridge freezers are things that you plug in or hardwire in. So I've been going down the line of assessing whether we need electrical installation testing more rigorously or PAT testing more rigorously. This surely comes under PAT testing. But also, whilst they're white good products, what about smaller portable devices like hair straighteners, hair dryers and small portable electrical heaters? What evidence do you have of those? And also, would you suggest that PAT testing should become part of that regime? And if so, is there not an onus then also on the tenant?
I'm sorry, Paul, we don't have a significant amount of evidence on this. It's not our area of expertise, but I suppose perhaps I'm afraid I'm not really in a position to answer on.
Okay. No.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Paul, I would just add the point as well that I don't know anybody in owner-occupied sector who gets PAT testing either. That's not to say it shouldn't happen at all. So, it is an interesting area to look at. I mean, obviously in the workplace, we get it. I'm not even sure, is it every year we have the PAT testing, or is it every, but it's, I know that it's not happening in owner-occupied either, and I certainly know that the struggles that individual households are under, I can't see that it would be something that we'd be able to afford. I'm not even sure how much it would cost to have an engineer or whatever out of the house to test every product.
Yeah.
So
as far as my understanding is, no domestic setting needs to get PAT tested at present. There is requirements for electrical installation testing, but I don't think it's 5 years. I'm out of the game a long time. There is an issue with regards to the 5-year period for getting tested, but we do know that registration is every 3 years. Would you be content that a testing regime would be set out every 6 years, which means then that every other registration would require the testing certificates rather than every 5 years? Because that, if you like, doesn't run concurrently or neatly with the registration, and if you tie it all in together, Do you think that there will be more chance of compliance?
Well, I'm not sure. I would have to sort of think about it, look and, understand is there any unintended consequences in other areas. So the answer really, I don't know if Jamie has anything additional to add, but I'm not sure about that one yet. But we'll give it a discussion and I think over, and maybe speak to the charity that would have more expertise in this area really.
Yes. And also just on your clause 9, I think there is an issue there, a massive issue around energy efficiency. And that even comes down to simple things like windows, and making sure that there's proper windows and frames fitted with proper ventilation within. All of these things, small requirements can make big differences here. And I think we need to emphasise this in the clauses. And the point that the Chair makes around access winter deaths, again, just to repeat, this should be highlighted more. It should be in the press more. We should be talking about it more, because people are dying, literally dying of freezing and on their own in some cases. So I'm certainly supportive of raising that issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Kelly, you want it back in?
Chair, yes, I just want to follow up on Paul's point. Pat and Jamie, Paul had mentioned there about windows, and we know that the whole house, there's things that we can do to the whole house. Years ago I used to work for Chest, Heart and Stroke, and one of the things that we were very concerned about was the sealing up of windows, so there was no drafts, and fireplaces being then closed up, so again there was no drafts. And what we actually saw as a result of that was more damp in houses after those drafty places had been closed up. I'm just wondering, is there anything there from your understanding of energy in homes, of how we can ensure, like for instance, if you close up all the drafts and then you have damp, what is it that is the problem? Is this down to, damp-proof courses, the insulation? What do we need to be thinking about?
In ventilation, Kelly, I mean, that became a big issue over the last couple of years, even within the warm home scheme and the affordable warm scheme. It isn't a matter of just blocking everything up, because you need to have a flow. As we all are sitting here today, we're creating moisture as well, so there needs to be appropriate ventilation, and that needs to be part of the design of our homes and how we're living. And if we do decide then to be sticking cavity walls in and loft insulation, that the industry are aware of this, because they've talked to us about the issue, that there is the appropriate ventilation as well. Otherwise there's water running down people's walls and into their bedrooms and things as well. We've seen all manner of things like that as well.
So there's no point then in going for a passive house standard where you close up that house to heat it better, but actually it creates unintended consequences.
No, a passive house, if it's done correctly, has has ventilation extraction. There is a mechanism put in there to ensure that there is a flow of air, but it's obviously more technical than that. The passive houses, I've seen can work very well so again, all part of the mix as well in terms of the future for Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Mark, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Pat, and thanks, Jamie, for that. Just a couple of wee things, and what caught my eye was your comments or response to some of the provisions in clause 4 around deposits, and the view of Property Mark that deposit cap of 1 month's rent would be insufficient. I was just wondering if maybe you could elaborate on that a wee bit.
Again, we spoke to Housing Rights about this, Mark. This isn't our expertise, so we would be supportive of what Housing Rights were saying. So I'm not really over the detail on that. I don't know if Jamie has any additional points.
No, I would just reiterate, we work very closely with Housing Rights, and we would rely on them for their expertise on those particular aspects of the bill. So we went through a briefing process with them, and we're just happy to say that National Energy Action supports their arguments and their position on it.
Okay, so the same would apply to the other provisions in clause 4 around the limits on rent paid in advance, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Pat and Jamie, for your presentation, the work you do and your engagement with us all. Obviously, energy efficiency is very important, and you rightly do a lot of good work highlighting that. Just last week, we heard from the students' body, NUS-USI, in terms of their experiences as younger people. And I suppose that confirmed that the issue impacts all ages, young and the older people, which is often being referenced. Just wondering, have you much engagement with that student body, I suppose, and students in general?
Not as much as we probably could have. We are out in homes in some areas as well in the Holy Lands where there's a lot of poor housing as well. So we have some projects where if people are getting into difficulty, we can maybe stick a couple of quid on their meter and that. But I mean, we engage with a broad coalition across the fuel poverty coalition, as Jamie has highlighted, 160 organisations, and the unions, and that would be involved with that as well. But we could do better in trying to engage with some other groups as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. All right, there's no other member has signalled that they want to ask anything further. Can I thank you, Pat and Jamie, for your time today? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me along.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All the way.
Excuse me. Members, agenda item 5, we were due to have a briefing from Hmos Connect on the private tenancies bill, but unfortunately we won't be hearing from Hmos Connect today, as we've been informed that they're unavailable due to illness, and just pass on our committee's best wishes to Nicola and her team there, and I hope that everybody makes a speedy recovery. Then can I just move us along then? Sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
Can I just ask, just before we do bring in our next people, can we write to the Committee for Economy, who are looking at the energy strategy, I think, at the moment? It would be really useful if we could find out if they're dealing with some of these issues so that this bill doesn't have to, in particular about what energy efficiency levels, the level that they're looking at, and if damp is contained within that. It'd be useful to have that sort of overlap with the two committees.
I think that's a very good idea. Yes, we'll do that. All right, members, if we move on then to agenda item 6, which is Landlords Association for Northern Ireland, and they're again briefing us on the private tenancies bill. You'll find their briefing paper at page 77 of your packs. And then can I welcome Richard Smith to our meeting this morning? Richard, you're very welcome if you want to go ahead and brief the committee.
Thank you. Yes, I'm an estate agent, Chartered Surveyor, and I'm a member of the Lanny Committee. Yes, you've got my paper in front, and there are 3 main items on that agenda. But I wonder, should I, after that very interesting discussion on energy efficiency, I wonder, should I start on my second point regarding that? Because we have around 500 tenants in my agency that we look after. Now, some of them are students, some of them are family houses, some of them professional houses, so the full spectrum is covered. Problem, I think, in Belfast, where most of my business is, that they're all old houses, or most of them are older houses built at the turn of the century. They don't have cavity walls; they have solid walls, and a lot of the discussion there was about cavity walls and insulation. Insulation is the key in my view, and we have been, in quite a few cases, we have been insulating the outside walls of houses, using the Kingspan type 75mm of insulation with a plasterboard sheet on the outside of it. We have done quite a number of those. It is, and I think that's where we should be expanded, or we need to do more of it. There are various problems, and I'm sure the committee are aware of the problems of doing that sort of insulation. The reveals around the windows cause a big issue, because the window maybe has 2 inches of frame against the reveal, and yet you want to ideally put a 75 or 80mm piece of insulation on that reveal. You can plaster and insulate the wall up to the edge of the reveal. Going into the window is difficult. The real answer is to cut the plaster work back by 75mm and insulate it properly, but that's expensive. But insulation of The old Belfast terraced house with a solid wall is a problem, but it's also will be the answer to most of this. It's expensive, and it probably could be £4,000 or £5,000 per house to do it right. By the time you do the loft insulation, it's the easy bit, but the exterior walls are the hard bit. I've also been looking at, people are talking about heat exchangers and heat pumps, but they don't work as far as I can see in the terraced houses in Belfast. The heat pump, it will work well on new build, because you need, well, I don't know what the knowledge on it is, but the heat pumps tend to work at 55 degrees, whereas your normal radiator in a house is at 65 to 70 degrees. Heat pumps work well for underfloor heating, but that's not really going to be appropriate in the standard old Belfast house. So, and plus the fact that you need more room in the yard than we would have in many of the Belfast houses. So heat pumps are going to be difficult, but I think they're not going to be appropriate for 90% of the terraced houses in Belfast. Photovoltaic cells on the roof aren't really going to work. The roofs are not big enough. We have dormers and Veloxes and all sorts of things. And then gas boilers are going to be banned in the near future. It leaves us with a problem. I tend to think that the answer to energy efficiency for the standard Belfast terrace house in the future is going to be an electrical system. The smarter radiators that are now available would work. It will mean rewiring the house, and it's quite a big step to take out a wet system from a terraced house. It would be quite a step for landlords, and put in a completely electrical system, not like the old storage heater system we used to have 30 years ago, but the new smart electrical radiators with timers and thermostats, etc., would work quite successfully. The problems then will be, what do you do with your hot water? If you have an electric shower, that's okay for washing. You can put geysers and under sink geysers for the hot water at the sinks. But where it doesn't work is then when you want a bath. And that's more appropriate to family houses than maybe HMOs or whatever, because they tend to want showers. So it's not an easy solution to get to this carbon zero, energy efficient aim that we all have. But I tend to think that electrical is going to be the way forward. Now that then leads me to the next problem. Will the grid handle it, particularly with electric cars, etc. as well? And the generation of power in Ballylumford and wherever, how much of that's going to be renewable? So it's not an easy, achieving C we can do. To move it further than that and to be actually carbon neutral and better than C with our current housing stock, it's difficult. Getting back to the proposal for C, for the private rented sector, it's achievable, but it will take time. I have analysed. I think at my agency I have 90 properties which are below C. Now, if I was to do one of those a fortnight, that's 25 a year. That's maybe 4 years to bring them up to speed, and that would be ambitious. If the minimum standard of C flicks in with a specific date, I don't think there'll be enough. I don't think there'll be enough installers and technicians in Belfast to actually get them up unless you give us, a bit of time. I don't know in practice how that will be done. Whether we do a D, well, that wouldn't even help because, if you bought D to start with and then C, we would then concentrate. We wouldn't have to concentrate on the ones which are currently with the D rating. We could concentrate on the E's and the F's, and then bring in C maybe 2 or 3 years later. But in principle, I'm not opposed to I'm in favour of reducing fuel poverty, reducing our emissions, etc. We're all in favour of that. But just the way it's brought in, we have to be a little bit careful. Because there's no legislation or no regulation for the private rented sector, the worry is that if we're too ambitious, with the private rented sector. Landlords will just say, I'm not doing that, I can't afford to do it, I don't want to do it, and they will sell the properties into the owner occupied sector, and then the private rented sector will shrink. With the result, rents will go up, etc., etc. So this is a delicate one and a difficult one to implement. So that's my reflections on the energy efficiency programme. It'll have to be dealt with sensitively and with much consultation. But in principle, we would agree with the aims. I had said in our paper that I would rather it was optional, but I suspect that might be too slow to implement. So that's my thoughts on the energy sector of the private rented sector, the private tenancies bill.
Okay, Richard, look, thank you. I think you've just added to our list of questions around the energy strategy to the Department for the Economy. Yeah, because quite often when we think of the private rented sector, we think of that a semi in a private housing development, and yeah, you've brought up very good issues there around those many terrace streets within Belfast. And the issues around that, and I think that there are some questions we do need to ask of the Department for Economy around that. And you'd mentioned about heat pumps, and if I am right, there also needs to be backup there for those as well in the form of an oil tank also.
That's right.
Yeah, so that causes issues, and I just happen to be the partner of a heating engineer, and he has brought up the issue around those people that are actually trained to do this. Do we have enough people there to actually hit the ground running to do all this? So I think you've given us lots of questions there that we will field to the Department for the Economy and get some answers on. Because there's really, if we're trying to look at energy efficiency within this bill, Kelly's quite right, the Vice Chair, we need answers first and foremost on that. So thank you for getting into a wee bit more detail on that around the cost and everything else. That's certainly very helpful. If I can just then ask you some of some other issues to do with your submission, and I want to actually ask you around the issue of deposits. You had mentioned in your paper the potential of unintended consequences of the bill regarding deposits, in that if landlords cannot charge a higher deposit for some types of client in specific reasons, they might not wish to rent to those clients. Can you give more detail just around reasons for that and how we might find a solution to that?
Yes. The current in Northern Ireland, as in the rest of the UK, the standard, if a tenant comes into us, we ask them for 1 month's deposit. If their application is acceptable, we ask them for 1 month's deposit. At that stage, then we type up an agreement, send it out to them, their guarantors, etc. But they need 1 month's deposit and the guarantor, and that's fairly standard here and across the rest of the UK. The problem is if they don't have a guarantor, and that now it's not in 90%. I think 93% or 92% of my tenancies that we have in the office here, we got 1 month's deposit and a guarantor. It was the other 8 or 9% that didn't have a guarantor. Now, very often those were foreign nationals. They were either students or coming over here to work, and they didn't have a guarantor in Northern Ireland. Now, when I go to a landlord and say, if we have 4 or 5 applications on our desk, and 3 of them have got a 1 month's rent and a guarantor, and the 4th one has 1 month's rent and no guarantor, every landlord's going to say, take the one with the guarantor. So they're immediately they're going to be that small percentage of foreign students. And I have cases too where parents did not want to do guarantee. They were happy to pay 4 months' rent in lieu. I did the same myself. My daughter's in university in Glasgow, and I had the option there in Glasgow. What do you want to do? Do you want to do a guarantee or pay? I think it was 3 months' rent there. I paid 3 months because if I was going to do guarantor, I had to do proof of earnings, all sorts of paperwork. The guarantee, and I just said it's easier just to pay 3 months' rent and I'll get it back. The deposits today are so well protected under the tenancy protection scheme that there's no doubt, unless your offspring have been very silly, you're going to get your deposit back. They're extremely well, so it is really almost a loan. And I had spoken to another agent there a couple of days ago, and he was doing the same for his daughter. The guarantee, you had to prove that to be a guarantor, you had to prove you're earning over 30,000 a year and have at least 6 months in employment. And if you didn't fulfill that criteria, you weren't an acceptable guarantor. And your option was to give, well, now in England it's been restricted to 5 weeks, so I don't know what they've done. I suspect this was last year he was doing this. I suspect he might not have been acceptable as a, well, he could give those guarantees because he did fulfil the criteria. But if you weren't able to, if you didn't fulfil the criteria to be a successful guarantor, the tenant is likely to be turned down. And we don't want to turn down tenants. We want to be able to let to everybody that we want to be able to let to. If I am saying to a landlord, I've got a tenant here with a 1 month's rent and a guarantor, and I have another tenant with 1 month's rent plus a 4 months deposit, I regard those, and most landlords would regard those as being of equivalence. So I think this proposal to limit deposits is counterproductive. It will not affect 90% of the tenancies that are being applied for, and the 10% that it does affect, it will have a negative effect, totally negative effect. It appears from the Department of Communities, their publication on the resident for the bill. They thought that the increased deposit was going to be necessary because of the proposed increased notice period. They thought that if people were going to be asked, or were going to have to be given 8 weeks' notice to leave, that landlords might be tempted to ask for an increased deposit. I have spoken to no landlord who would intend to do that. I think the department seemed to come up with this one out of the blue, but it's not suggested by anybody. If I found that the other estate agents were all charging 2 months' rent deposit for all their tenancies, I would keep mine at a month, and I'd let all my houses and theirs would stick. So, this, quite frankly, I think this is an ill thought out suggestion in the legislation.
I know Mark has a supplementary, but just for bring him in on this, Richard, if you were faced, and I know because we hear this is happening now, where you have a private rental becomes available, and you maybe have 10 people that are interested in that, surely you're going to take the one who can provide the most, no matter what is written down in legislation. Would that be right in saying that? Because you're going to take the one that can provide the most security. Whether that's a collaboration of a guarantor plus 3 months or whatever. Would that be true in saying that? Because that's just life.
No, I would say I would regard as 1 month's deposit and a guarantor as that is the best. I actually prefer a guarantor to a large deposit. No, I don't need any more than 1 month and a guarantor. If somebody offers me 3 months and the guarantor, I don't think I need it. I don't think I'd asked for it. We are in a little bit of a blip at the moment in that there's, I don't know if it's post-COVID or whatever, but the demand at the moment is the highest that I can remember.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking of
we are getting multiple applications for everything.
That's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of a bidding war nearly, which we have with anybody actually buying a house, especially first-time buyers. So rental's the same. We could get into a bit of a bidding war, and we can't stop some of those things happening because that is just the nature of how things roll out. That was all. That's why I just asked that question. I think what will happen if we get 10 or 20 applications for a house, rather than taking an increased deposit, the rents are going to go up, and that's just the nature of the business. That if there's excess demand over supply, rents go up. So I think that will be the effect rather than increasing deposits. Okay.
So I don't think it'll affect deposits at all.
All right. Look, thanks, Richard. I'm going to bring Mark in. Has a supplementary, I think, there.
I had the discussion kind of organically went to where I was going to bring it, and that's in terms of the danger of creating that sort of auction situation. I think, can I say, Chair, this is a very important session today. I think Lanny, or the voice of the landlords, is an extremely important voice, because while our primary focus in terms of this legislation is around tenant protection, it's ultimately about the workability of the sector, and it won't work if we're frightening landlords off through excessive bureaucracy, or certainly not the risk of irrecoupable, I don't know if that's a word, irrecoupable expense. So if I could even bring it on just a wee bit from where you are, Chair, it's still a supplementary, because we're in the same clause, and that would be around the notice to quit provisions in the bill. Richard, if maybe we could touch on that. And you believe, or your organisations have the view that in cases where there are rent arrears of 2 months, the notice period, the extended notice period, shouldn't apply. Can you elaborate on that? You know, just in terms of the difficulty that causes, or could potentially cause landlords.
Well, it's just for the time. Firstly, I see a lot of merit in a family home in increased. I have no problem with increasing it to 8 weeks, because I accept that in the case of family homes, yes, it does take time to find somewhere else, relocate your children, etc., change school, whatever. And in most cases where we want possession of a house for some reason, that's been a family home and they've been in it for a few years, we don't generate. I can't remember ever just blandly serving notice to quit and say you have to go at the end of next month. We would usually have discussions with them and say, look, the landlord is thinking of selling, they're thinking of moving back into the house, or whatever reason. And you would generally have a discussion with them and say, look, you know, tell us how you get on. There's no big price. We'll give them a month. So very often it's reasonably done. But I can see a lot of merit in giving a couple of months. The different cases are the cases where somebody has stopped paying rent. And I have one particular case where she hasn't paid me any rent for 2 years. And with COVID, I haven't been able to get to court. We have issued proceedings in small claims court to get some of the money back. But she's thumbing her nose at us. And there are cases like that. Not every tenant is a saint. And there are tenants where they have exploited the current legislation, because it takes a year to get somebody put out anyway. If you go to court to evict somebody, it takes about a year and several £1,000s. So there are cases where I think the landlord doesn't want to be taken advantage of, and that's why I'm saying if there are rent arrears, the extended notice shouldn't apply.
Okay, thank you. And any other circumstances, I suppose, where you think it shouldn't apply?
Well, the other one was, I said, was HMOs. HMOs are a difficult one. They're always temporary, almost always temporary accommodation. They're not for family use. You don't have to really, if you're in an HMO, you're normally very often a younger person. You're not going to have to relocate your children to new schools, etc. There can be cases where we want to ask, and it's again usually done by negotiation, we want to ask a slightly difficult tenant to leave. Some of the HMOs, not the student ones, but some of the other HMOs, you find that one tenant, the chemistry's wrong. They're the ones that don't clean the bathroom, don't clean the kitchen, they've hogged all the cupboards for all their food, and the other 3 or 4 tenants, they've all decided we can't stick this tenant. And you have to ask that one to leave, or you're going to lose the other 4. So there are cases like that we would rather be able to act more swiftly. And it's not even we can't even claim it's antisocial behaviour. It's just the chemistry's wrong. So there have been cases we've had to ask people to leave, and we don't want to wait 2 months, so we might lose everybody else.
Some of the examples of that the behaviour you outlined there would suggest that my wife won't need to give me any notice if she wants if she wants me to leave. But we're just saying HMOs in some circumstances I'd be aware of, there would be maybe single men having been forced to move into HMOs due to a lack of insufficient alternative accommodation. They might have access to children at weekends or a couple of nights a week. So while it wouldn't be a family home per se, it does offer some security and allows that relationship and access to children to continue. So you have to be, I suppose, nuanced in terms of our approach to this.
If I can say yes, and what if the chap in the next door room was dabbling in drugs and would that's the other case where you might have to say, listen, this is not on, you have to go. And we want to be able to deal with that more swiftly. And that is could be a particular problem in HMOs with single people who maybe someone will be on the margins of society.
Without a doubt. No, thank you, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I just, before I open up, I have Kelly and then I have Paul. Just want to go back to deposits again. And we heard from the students last week about an issue of getting the refund on their deposits. It's just, are you aware of any problems? And I'm not saying that you're up to this, but there are some landlords out there where we have heard as constituency MLAs that there's a problem in getting deposits back. And do you think that we can resolve this through the bill?
I think the deposits are so well protected. We gave 87% of our deposits back in full. I checked there last year, that was last September. Your deposit, of the actual disputes, I spoke to TDS, the Tenant Deposit Scheme, and they say that only 0.94%, less than 1% of deposit claims result in a dispute. So it actually, at the end of the tenancy, if we want to retain somebody for cleaning, or actually in most of ours it was because there were some rent arrears, we put our evidence in to claim whatever we want from the deposit, £300 or £400 it might be for rent and cleaning, etc. The tenant rebuts that or otherwise. This is all done online. The tenancy deposit scheme make a decision based on the evidence submitted. We then both accept it or enter a dispute, and it's the most well-regulated system that you could ask for. So I'm not aware of any big problems with anybody getting their deposit back. I can't see how there would be, because the system is running so well.
What about timeframes, though, Richard, for getting your deposit back? And some people, I know of one person, one of my children it was, that waited, I think it was 16 weeks or something to get their deposit back, and the house, because I cleaned it, was in a much better state than what they found it, I can assure you. There was not a thing wrong with it. What about timescales? What's the average timescale? Does it fall, is it good, or is that experience I had just, something that doesn't regularly happen?
It's usually been because, in our experience, the tenant hasn't responded quickly enough. I'm not sure about your case, but because everything's done by email, there are strict deadlines in the tenancy deposit scheme legislation, and we find from our point of view that very often it's because the tenant hasn't responded. Sometimes they don't know they have to respond. So that's usually where the delay is, but the deadlines are fairly good in the legislation. Don't think there's much amendment needed there.
Okay, thank you for that, Richard. I've got Kelly and I've got Paul also waiting to ask, so go to Kelly first.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks very much for adding to our woes here, because you've mentioned something today about the guarantors that the bill is, you're absolutely correct, is completely silent on. And you've raised some interesting issues about newcomers who come to live in Northern Ireland who may not have a guarantor. I'm just wondering, how do landlords get round that at this stage in order to enable, renting out to people who have no guarantors? How does that happen, or is there another organisation, a charity or another organisation that steps in as their guarantor?
Well, not in my experience. Because demand is so good at the moment, if somebody hasn't got the big deposit or a guarantor, quite frankly, they don't get a house, and that's not a get round. Now, I know that some other landlords have taken rent in advance, and some of them have even asked for a year in advance, because most of why we want a 4 month deposit from maybe foreign tenants or tenants from other parts is that we've had a long time ago we've had experience of they get on a plane and go home and you don't know if they're coming back or not. That's the worry. Mainly it's for rent. So you could ask for rent in advance. I'm not keen on it. But we've had people offering that to us. We will pay you a year, and I have some tenants have actually paid me a year ahead, not because I asked for it, but because they wanted just to get rid of it. And those are mums and dads of students. So you could ask for rent, a full year's rent to be paid, but that would be worse than a 4 months deposit. So I'm not keen on it. I think Shelter used to run a system where they would have guaranteed a deposit or paid a deposit, but I think that was only up to 1 month, and I haven't. I'm not sure if it still runs or not.
Okay, I'm just wondering then if a tenant who's a newcomer to the country, I suppose they could well be housed by the Northern Ireland office if they have refugee status. So there may be some protections there. So what you're saying is if someone arrives in Northern Ireland, they've secured work, it would be very difficult for them to go into private rent to secure a home because they wouldn't have the guarantors. And it's hard to sort of see how we can get round that if that is one of the requirements. But the bill is completely silent on this. It doesn't provide any options or opportunities with regards to the deposit limit of a month's rent. It's completely silent on that for newcomers who don't have guarantors. There's nothing about it. You also mentioned as well increased deposit for pets, for allowances then for increased deposits for certain circumstances, and that would be emotional support pets. I take it that would apply across all assistance animals.
It would more or less. The odd person has a lizard or something, and they probably don't even tell me until we're inspecting the house. They forget to ask for permission. Mainly they're dogs and cats, and in our experience, they love their wee doggies and their wee cats, but we can smell them when we're getting possession of the house back. We can usually smell dog and cat, and quite a few cases we have to change at least one or two of the carpets, and then they tend to scratch doors and stuff like that. Now, particularly in the last year since COVID, we've had an increasing number of applications for emotional support pets, and we don't want to turn them down. But in the ones that we have said yes, we have said we want to charge an extra month's deposit, and they've all said yes and given it to. They're happy enough to do it, and we are happy enough to grant it. We'd rather than bring a pet in, but we accept that it can be of use to them. Because it does give us extra work when the house comes vacant. We usually have to do a bit of carpeting or whatever, so it's extra work which you could do without. But we tend to accommodate where we can, but we do need an extra month.
Okay. I wanted to ask you as well, because the bill's also silent on fees charged by landlords. So we know that letting agent fees are not permitted, but the legislation about letting fees, I'm just reading this, letting fees in Northern Ireland only applies to fees which are charged by agents. If your landlord doesn't use an agent, the landlord is allowed to charge you fees. If you feel that the fees your landlord is charging are excessive, you could speak to trading standards. Do you have any thoughts on those fees? Because the bill is currently silent on those types of landlord fees.
I have no experience of landlords charging fees directly. I don't know, because we let on behalf of all of our landlords. I just have no knowledge of that.
Okay, I'm just thinking, if there are other items that are being brought in as a result of this bill, for instance, the energy efficiency or the electrical standards, or as Mr. Frew has talked about, the PATS testing, if that's the sort of fees that landlords can actually charge, should we be thinking about capping those or restricting those?
I don't think there's evidence of landlords abusing that. I don't think so. We could try and legislate for every possible eventuality, but I don't think there'd be enough evidence to show that landlords are charging other fees. The PAT testing is not expensive; it's maybe 50 quid. It's not too bad. I think not. Maybe there could be merit in extending the ban on agents charging fees to the same for landlords. But I don't know whether you could do it in this bill or not. The sort of thing that used to be charged was if you were doing a credit reference on guarantors or tenants. That was the sort of fee that used to be charged out to tenants, but that's now. I don't think anybody's allowed to do that or does that now. I don't know whether private landlords use that or not.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you one last thing. The restriction on the frequency of rent increases to every 12 months. Any thought on that? We've had some concerns that if this comes in, landlords then will charge or increase their rental costs every 12 months. Any thoughts on that?
It's not worrying me. I don't think I've ever increased the rent twice in 12 months, so it's almost irrelevant. I have no thoughts on it. I sometimes, if people renew, we would like to nudge the rents up every year, but very often the people renew for another year. We charge the same rent the second year, and then the third year we have a look at it. If people are in long term, it probably makes sense to nudge them up every year, at least every 2 years, because you're always the worst in the world if you let a house and don't put the rent up for 5 years, and then after 5 years you try to put up the current rent at that stage. You're the worst in the world. They may have benefited from low rent for the last 4 years, but you're the worst in the world for suddenly sticking it up by £50 or £60 per month. You're nearly better to put it up by £10 a month. It's just to keep pace with rents in the area.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard.
That's grand. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring Paul in next.
Yes, see, before I go on, can I just, it was remiss of me not to declare an interest at the start, so I will declare it now. Apologies for that, Chair. I had a really great night last night, so a wee bit cloudy, so you all forgive me for not being just on top of things this morning. So I will declare that interest as being an owner of a rented property. Can I ask just, on clause 11, you talked about HMOs, which I think is very interesting. And as I see it, there's probably a couple of particular types of HMO. You have the student type, and then you have the type that I believe could well be connected to employment. Is it your evidence that there is that type of HMO where there will be many people in the same employee living in the one property? And if there is that scenario playing out and increasing, should there be further regulation on that type of HMO?
I don't think I have any cases where it's led to a lot of people who are working in the same group, maybe one or two, maybe a house of 4 or 5, maybe 2 of them working for the same company. No, I think it's better. I think it's just better left alone. That I don't know what we could add to the legislation which would help. No, I don't think it's anything. I can't see. The other thing I left out was the HMOs for students.
Yeah.
And not leaving the increased notice period out for those. We, in the student case, it might be relevant as well to the ones where people are all working for the same company. If very often you have a 5-bedroomed house and you ask for they've been running for a year. You come round to January or February and say, "Okay, you're going to renew for another year," and they will say to us, "I'm hoping to, but one of the tenants is moving out. 4 of the other 4 of us want to stay. We're trying to find a 5th person." Now we can either put a deadline on them of, well, we'll have to know by the end of February or the end of March, but generally, because we would let most of our houses before Easter for the coming academic year. If we increase the notice period from 4 weeks to 8 weeks, it means I have to give them a deadline. We want renewals. We want to accommodate our tenants as best we can. So we very often say that, keep looking, and there comes a day when you have to say, right, enough's enough. You haven't found somebody. We have to say you have to go at the 31st of August or whatever. But it's nice from the tenant's point of view. It's an advantage if we don't have to bring it to a head earlier than we otherwise do at the moment. So that's the other wee case where I think HMOs maybe should be excluded from the increased notice period.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting concept. I think we will have to explore, because last week we had asked questions around students and why they had been left out. Any not necessarily students, but anybody with less than a 12-month tenancy. suppose is the more specific and accurate piece. So I think we do have to give that more development of thought, to be fair. Can I ask you about the issue around payment with cash and cash only? How prevalent is that in your world, where people can only pay by cash only, either a deposit or rent?
It's not. Sometimes a deposit comes in by cash, and we give them a receipt for that. You have to give them. You'd want to give them a receipt. Rent virtually, well, in my office, virtually no cash comes in, and particularly since the pandemic, we don't even want people coming into our office. So the vast majority of our rents, well, certainly our student rents, are all paid by direct debit. We get some checks in. A little bit of cash comes in. I have a cash desk here, so if we have to take cash, it comes into the cash desk. There's a receipt given. It is difficult. The requirements to have a receipt which shows how much rent outstanding, etc., is a little bit difficult if we were taking cash, and it's another reason why we'll probably refuse all cash. Occasionally, somebody has rent arrears, and in the past, before the pandemic, they might have come in with 50 quid cash to my cash desk, and given that we've really more or less closed our cash desk now. Private landlords might take cash. It's to be frowned upon because you're not sure how much they're declaring for tax, etc. as well.
Yeah.
So I can accept there might be a problem somewhere. But I don't know how prevalent it is. It's certainly for agents. Most agents don't want cash.
Yeah. You can see where there's all sorts of horrors and manipulation stories there just coming out of my head there when I think through that scenario. Just to touch on something the Deputy Chair said about something that's not in the bill, and that's about letting agents. One specific area I want to ask you about is resolving disputes between tenants and landlords. Is there something in your world or in your experience you think could actually improve that dispute mechanism, call it what you may, with regards to disputes between tenants and landlords, to ensure that it's resolved fairly and quickly, which is probably more important, or just as important? Is there anything that is left out of this bill that you think could help that scenario, and should it be in the bill?
I don't think you do it in the bill. We've got the housing rights mediation service now, which I haven't used, because we would try and resolve most issues with our tenants ourselves. But yes, the mediation service would be there if we wanted it. I don't think it needs to go into the bill. I don't think you want to be forced to have to use it. We would resolve most of our issues amicably, and not an issue. Now, the tenants learn to negotiate. I do not think that the whip hand is always in the hand of the landlord. The tenants are the ones that have the rent in their pocket, and if we have a dispute with a tenant for something, their tendency is to withhold the rent until it's resolved. So I think there's a fairly equal balance of power, and the disputes happen in every business, but they are, in my experience, they're all resolvable. And as I say, if people are being difficult, the mediation service by the Housing Rights Department or Housing Rights organisation is available. So probably nothing needed in the legislation.
Can I take you back to clause 11 then with regards, and I think you said right, and I'm going to be primitive in my language here, but you basically said that rent arrears could well then lead to, or should lead to, diminished rights with regards to notice to quit. Now, I can get that. I can get that a landlord isn't getting rent in and needs to resolve the issue before it gets out of hand. And so then you would give what's the point of having a tenant that's not paying you rent? So you need to resolve that issue quickly for everyone's sake. But is it as primitive as rent arrears equals diminished rights? And what would that actually look like in the face of a bill? And is there any other circumstances where tenants should get diminished rights? Let's say, for instance, if the tenant destroys the property or part of, and then, of course, the landlord's in a very difficult position whereby he's seeing a property being reduced day by day, and he needs to act quickly. So you can see there money coming in, and diminished property. Should that equal diminished rights with regards to notice?
I think it's a nice idea, but I think it'll be very hard to legislate for. The rent arrear one is a simple one, and you're either in arrears or you're not. I think if you tried to write a clause which would say that you're damaging the property or neglecting the property or whatever, therefore you've lost the additional rights of an extra month's notice. I think it would be hard to prove, and we would all be worried that you would go to court, which might be 6 months later, and the judge would look at your notice to quit and say, you only give 1 month, and the legislation says you should be 2. You're claiming you've given the reduced notice because they had damaged the property. Where's your proof? And then the tenant will argue back, that was an whatever. So I don't think it would work. I would be worried about going to court and having my notice to quit declared invalid and having to start the whole process again. Rent arrears are simple. Other clauses more difficult.
So if it's rent arrears, it's a simple, clear cut, because you're in arrears, you're not.
Yeah.
What period of time of arrears would be acceptable for you to start diminishing rights of notice?
Well, I've said 2 months. The particular one that's causing me trouble was 2 years. So that's a little bit too long. 2 months or even 3 months. But that's sort of 3 months might even be reason. I suggested 2, but I could live with 3 because people have a reason sometimes why they haven't paid this month's rent. You know, they're changing jobs or whatever, and we all tend to be sympathetic. Maybe 3 months would be better. I'm open to. I've floated the suggestion because I'm stinging from the one that I'm losing at the moment.
Yeah, of course. Okay, listen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Mark?
Again, Richard preempted a wee bit there, because I was going to come in and say rent arrears isn't quite as black and white as you initially presented it there, Richard. You know, there's a difference between people maybe willfully withholding rent or choosing to spend money in other ways and then simply not having the money. You know, be it someone who's lost their job, someone who has the 5-week wait for universal credit, or whatever. And we have to be sympathetic to that. I'd be afraid that by doing away with the notice to quit period or reducing it in circumstances for rent arrears might give some landlords just a sort of licence to throw people out as soon as they enter choppy waters, and that's the last thing that we do want to do, of course. And I made the point earlier, the vast majority of landlords here are reasonable and responsible, and it wasn't Paul Frew's declaration of interest that reminded me that not all are. I'm just but I'm conscious that you've answered many of the questions that have been put to you in the first person singular, so you're referring to your experience and what you'd have done, but while you're representative of an organisation, you're not the same as every member of that organisation and the many landlords who aren't members of that legislation. So while we respect the evidence you're giving to us, we also have to be mindful that there are others there who mightn't be as scrupulous, and we have to legislate with them in mind and the protection of their tenants and prospective tenants as well. I just want to know, with your experience and from your perspective, is there anything else that could or should be in this bill just to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the private rented sector?
No, I think I actually think that the private rental sector is so heavily regulated now, particularly the HMO sector, but that would need a whole new day to talk about. I don't think there's much more needed. I think it's almost over-regulated now. I don't think there's anything more that needs to go in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Richard, for your presentation. Just more sort of a general point, I suppose, in terms of the private rented sector. Can you just elaborate, if you have any figures to hand or any knowledge, obviously, with your vast experience, about what percentage of properties are managed through letting agents, you know, in comparison to being managed directly by landlords, either within your own organisation or, you know, across the country? I suppose just I'm thinking of, obviously, if a property is managed directly through a letting agent and managed, where a landlord would pay a management fee, I suppose they, in theory, certainly, you know, they give the tenant some level of, you know, mediation and protection and I suppose reassurance, you know, when issues do arise. Have you any data or any knowledge around that, Richard?
I don't. I think the tenancy deposit scheme would probably be able to give us those sort of figures. I have the report here, but it doesn't give that figure. I don't know, except that it's not nearly enough landlords use it. But other than that, I don't have. The TDS would be able to give you that, I'm sure.
Right, okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. No other members indicated they want to ask anything further. So, Richard, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. All right, members, that's us almost finished. I'm going to move on to any other business. And I know, Kelly, you had wanted to raise an issue under any other business due with the Community Development Networks Forum.
Yes, it was just to say that this Thursday after the committee meeting, the Community Development Networks Forum will be in the Long Gallery for a drop-in session. The committee, of course, if you're free to attend, you can do so. They had written to us before and it was in our packs, I think, last week or the week before. And it's just there are representatives of the networks from all of the urban areas across Northern Ireland, so there should be one from your patch there.
Brilliant. Look, thank you. Thank you for reminding us of that. Agenda item 7 then, members, date, time and location of our next meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 18th of November at 9 AM in room 21. Thank you, members.
30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.